1 minute more.
Okay.
¿Cuál es el partido político? What is the political organization?
Liberal Party.
Liberal Party?
Liberal Party.
Liberal
So in Germany, it's in the center of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
Other countries might be more left or more right, but in Germany, it's in the middle. It's in the center.
Bueno, muy bien. Vamos a dar paso a la conferencia de Dirk, quien hablará en la próxima media hora. Y bienvenido, Dirk, a la Real Asociación de Hidalgos, y adelante en la palabra, por favor. Please, go ahead.
I need your help to see the whole, because it's Spanish. Señoras y señores, por favor, pardonnez par habler en anglais. Muchas gracias. The topic of my today's lecture is the German emperors between 800 and 1918, contribution to the high nobility to more than a millennium of German and European history. Is a very interesting, exciting, and important part of history that covers about 11 centuries, so a very, very long time that is, of course, not possible to present in less than 30 minutes. But I would like to give you an idea of some important events, facts and figures, so that you have a knowledge about different parts of the history, and I hope that I can provide some keys to this fascinating history. Over centuries, of course, high nobility formed the European continent. This time of more than a millennium can be splitted in different periods, so it is hopefully quite easy to understand the main noble houses in the very important time of German emperors from the Middle Ages until the abdication of the German and the Austrian emperors in 1918 after the end of the First World War. We are talking about the German word Kaiser, coming from the Latin Caesar, so the Augustus. It shows the universal understanding of an emperor with a great European frame that is important to know, because then we all as Europeans are able to understand the whole history. The world of today is of course a result of all of that, and in that frame all our ancestors lived when they came from Europe. Let us start with a quote. Hablo español con Dios, italiano con las mujeres, francés con los hombres y alemán con mi caballo. I found this a very exciting quote of your King of Spain and the later emperor. And I can understand with the French and the Italian, but I wonder the way he would use German with his horse. So that's very funny. But this quote also shows the multinational European character of the Roman German emperor. It is a multi-ethnical situation of one emperor who is able to speak different languages, and as far as I know, was able to actually live in these different cultures. And that makes an emperor from the early days on. There are different periods of history, and I would call it the Prestory. This is, we all know, a person with different names. that is Carolus Magnus or Charlemagne or Karl the Great. That is all the same person, but our national perspective gives him a different name. But it is the same person, and he is the first emperor after Roman times. He understood himself as being a part of this tradition, but the people around him never used the term Roman, so he was a very first emperor of a new dimension. Then we actually talk about the First Empire. The First Empire started in 962 and ended, and we know exactly the date when it ended. The Holy Roman Empire ended on the 6th of August, 1806. That was the Sacrum Romanum Imperium Nationis Germanici. Why this happened? Well, the Napoleon Wars have been the reason for that. So the emperor at that time, Franciscus II, put down the crown of the Holy Roman Empire and declared himself just being the emperor of Austria. And you see there is a break. There wasn't any German emperor until 1871, when William I have been crowned as being the German emperor. So there's a difference between the Austrian part and the German part, and even many people in my country would not be able to explain why that happened. So there was a split, and the Austrian part and the German part had the same ending as the abdication of the emperor, and that was in November of 1918. And you all know the term of the Third Reich, and the Third Reich comes from that counting, so that in the tradition of the First Empire that ended with Napoleon, and then the Second Empire started with William I and ended with William II, that was the tradition. The Nazis thought that should be the Third Reich. So let's come back to Charlemagne. German history begins with the Franconian, and that was a time when German and French was the same. So no one actually would have the idea to differentiate about all of that. Carolus Magnus was the first emperor who was having the idea of a greater empire coming together, and he was crowned as emperor in Rome in the year of 800. But he was not declaring himself as being a Roman empire. He received the crown as he was the center of power and protector of the Christian world, the Pope included. And for sure, this became a problem between the two institutions, so the emperor and the Pope. And that led into long-lasting quarrels, who is on top. Yeah? So just imagine around the date of 1000, we have got 5 million inhabitants in what we call Europe today, and in 1800, 25 million. So a very, very small population. So when we look on Karl the Great, he was the leader of the world. I mean, the leader of the whole world of that understanding. He was not only the protector of Christianity, but he was a wise leader, or should be a wise leader, a peacemaker, all at the same time. So one person sent by God leading the whole world. Karl the Great was a very powerful emperor, who was in Germany later, fought extremely hard against the Saxons. This is very important because 100 years later, they became the most powerful in the Reich. So it is important to know about Henry I, I'm going to talk about later, because he decided who will govern after what role in the next generation. Because here's the problem. Coming from the Franconian law, the first son would take over to be king. And that had the following problem, that all sons got a piece of the whole country, of the whole kingdom. And at the end, the small pieces became too small, and so that was a big problem in the continuity of the kingdom. And the German kings understood that this will be in the future of a very big problem. So you know that after the death of Carolus Magnus, we are talking about a brother war between the Germans and the French, but actually it was a war between an uncle and a nephew. So before we jump to that time, let's have a look on this wonderful monogram of him. We know that Karl the Great was not able to write, but it is very interesting that the people who could write formed this monogram here, and he put this little winkle in the middle of here. He ended this on this stage, and that was his signature. I mean, it's just fantastic to understand that is the emperor of that time who could not write, but when he signed it, that was a document that proved that he did it. So, I mean, that's very interesting. The only thing we have of his shape is this little coin over here, and perhaps you've heard about his throne in Aachen. That is very important to know because all the other German kings and emperors understood themselves being a follower of Karl the Great. That is why I call it a Prestory, because all the followers referred back to him. Just to give you an idea about the expansion of Karl the Great's empire at that time, so huge, very huge. The most important sign of the empire was, of course, the crown. And look at this magnificent work of art done in the second half of the 10th century, so 900 so-and-so. Yeah? And all the upcoming imperial emperors wore this crown. Also, the Spanish king that became an emperor then. That was this very crown. And this crown now is in the treasure in Vienna, because you heard me saying that the Austrian king at that time, being the emperor, put down the imperial crown and understood himself as being just the emperor of Austria. So in Germany, there is not this crown, but it is in Austria today. When it comes to the signs of power, very important, the imperial regalia, we call it the Reichsinsignien. That is very interesting with, you see the gloves and the shoes and the swords and all of that. And you see this globe, actually, that the emperor would wear in his hand. These are the signs of being an emperor. And there is something coming from the 10th century that is very important. It is the Holy Lance. Perhaps, of course, you know, the Holy Lance keeps the actual nail by which Jesus Christ had been crucified in Golgotha. So this comes from a very important siege, a battle in which a German king won because he had this sword with a little piece of a nail on the top. So all these magnificent things are the signs of power. Now let's go into the time frame in which this story begins. We are talking about the Holy Roman Empire between nearly 1,000 years, 800 plus, 900 plus years. We're talking about the Ottonians, the Salian, and the Hohenstaufen dynasties. And you see the length, how long this reign took. And you see in 3 consecutive times, there was a break because there was no living son anymore who survived the father, or not even any child. So this dynasty ended without any offspring. So this is very important to know, to see that these very powerful noble houses ended at one point, because they, of course, stuck to the tradition that it is a question of genealogy who will follow. But there is a change, and there used to be a change, that it was not only the genealogy, but the way how to define who will be the king and the emperor. And I'm going to talk about that later. But that is very important for you to know. There are 3 important houses, important dynasties who made possible this emperorship in the Roman German history. And after this time, we are talking about an interregnum, so a time where there was no German king or no emperor. And the people at that time understood this as a big problem, as a big crisis. And afterwards, we see different European dynasties in changing constellations, giving their people to become a king or to become an emperor. And this ends, as I said, in 1806, when Francis II puts down the Roman-German crown. So the Ottonian dynasty is a very important one, and it starts with Henry I, who was only a German king and not an emperor. But he did something that was very, very important. First of all, he was not that close connected with Karl the Great from the man's line, but in a bigger dimension. But he followed this tradition. That was very important, and he laid the ground of what then was the old empire, because he decided after what regulation a king should be elected. Let me see. It is the difference between the Germans and other nations was that in Germany the kings have been elected by noble people, and in other, so it was a mixture of genealogy and electoral part of inheritance. So that was a contrast to France or to England at that time. In contrast to France or England, where the kings defined by their ancestry alone, both of the countries were central-oriented. Germany had not a single place of power, so not a capital. The king had to show up in every single part of his kingdom. He was sitting in a saddle. Henry I defined not only his first son, but one of his sons to become a king. And you see the following generations became very strange here. Some of them became king at a very, very, as a little kid. Yeah? And so just by seeing these years, you can understand that there was a big problem growing. So this all ended here with these people. I mean, we have no paintings of Henry I, but we have got this wonderful seal, just to give you an idea. He changed the so-called house rule that says all power and the kingdom in one hand. This is his son, Otto I, called Otto the Great, with his seal over there. And he was crowned as the emperor in Rome. He had this magnificent crown with him, so it wasn't that spontaneous as history tells us. And Otto I is buried in this dome of Magdeburg that he is the founder of. The next generation, Otto the second, here shown in a very impressive seal. And then we've got the third one, Otto III, and you see he became king at the age of 3.5, an emperor at 16, and died at 22. So this line was going off. But it is very, very impressive to see when you look at the age of 1,000, so how big this country was. The next generation was the Salian dynasty, and here I just want to give you an idea of Henry IV. He was reigning of 56 years, and he was very famous. Every one of you knows, of course, Canossa, when he had to meet the Pope, and that was very strange at that time. Here, that is the longest reign. It was very, very difficult because Henry IV deposed the Pope, who banned and deposed the emperor. So that was really a lowest level of emperorship. But his son found a solution. Then we jump to the next generation, the next governing dynasty, the Hohenstaufen. And here we have, as most important in my understanding, Friedrich I, or Frederick I, called Barbarossa because of his red beard. And he's a very important emperor at that time. We see here this really magnificent painting sitting in the middle of two of his sons. This is one of the most incredible paintings on emperors. And the Barbarossa saying is very important. You know, Barbarossa died in 1190 on a crusade. And perhaps you remember that in 1990 there was the German unity. So the old story says that Barbarossa will come back when he will unite Germany in peace. And that was very interesting. I mean, I was 20 at that time, and I read about that. So we are still waiting for Barbarossa to return, but for some people, he returned because in 1990, it was possible to reunite a divided Germany. This monument here is very interesting because you see the horse on the top. That is the German King William I. So the reference to Barbarossa, and Barbarossa himself understood being a part of the tradition back to Karl the Great. So this is the historic line. Jumping back to Friedrich II, here he was a very, very educated medieval emperor. And he wrote a book that is important until today, De Arte Venadicum Avibus, the art of hunting with birds. So just imagine an emperor who actually is governing from the saddle, is running around, but loving birds. And he was, regarding these animals and describing and also painting these animals. Very, very interesting. The empire at that time, I mean, look at this, how huge that was. Map of the Holy Roman Empire after the Hohenstaufen dynasty about 1250. 1250 then was a break, the interregnum, so a time when there was no German or Roman-German emperor. So that was a part of instability. And the German dukes elected Rudolf I of Habsburg, becoming the German king, but he never became an emperor. But he was a very important German king. And you see after the Habsburg, there was the Luxembourg and Wittelsbach, and all these different lines governed in different periods of history. Here is again Carlos I of Spain, Emperor Carl V. When I was young, I could not understand why he was Carl I and also Carl V. So it took some years to understand why the same person has got two numbers on that. So he was crowned in Bologna, and that was the first time that a Roman-German emperor was crowned by the Pope. He was one of the most powerful emperors in the Holy Roman-German Empire. And if you want to see this wonderful painting here, you need to go to Munich and see this. That was the area of, Charles at that time. And now, at the end, what was the situation after 1806? So until the end of the German emperors, the German Kaisers. Napoleon crowned himself on December the 2nd of 1804, taking the crown from the Pope and crowning himself being the Emperor of France. And in the Napoleon Wars, the whole of Europe was in a unstable constellation, and so the emperor stepped down from the position of being the emperor of the whole Roman-German Empire. And then there was a break. Germany only had the Prussian king and different kings, and it took the development after the German-French War in 1870-71 that William I was declared the German Empire in Versailles. And you see a very, very tragic development in 1888, quite easy to keep in mind. 1888 was the year of 3 German emperors. So William I is not the father of William II, but the grandfather. And the Germans think about how history may have developed differently when the son, Frederick III, who was quite liberal and quite positive towards the British, if he had become the German king, perhaps the history would have been better as it was later. So both lines, the Austrian and the German line with the emperorship, ended both with the abdication in November of 1980. We did not kill our king. We sent him to the exile in the Netherlands where he could cut trees, what he did for years. And in Germany, in contrast to countries with monarchies, there is no big wish to have a monarch anymore. I would say that's over, but the Germans are very interested in the monarchy in other countries, and when I see my dear colleague Elizabeth Rhodes, I must say that the Queen perhaps is the most popular monarch, followed by the Spanish, of course. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to lecture here. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dirk. Very interesting. Any question? ¿Alguna pregunta? ¿Alguna pregunta? Okay. We are going to take a break.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Vamos a un break, a tomar un café.